The native police were patrolling the Cardwell and Ingham areas. The native police, also known as the Black Police, were tasked with the job of protecting the settlers from the local tribes. By the time the Djiru and Western and Northern nations were encountering European incursion, New South Wales has reached a degree of peace where the frontier wars had abated. The native police force was no longer needed in New South Wales, but Queensland was happy to employ the trained militia and send them to the areas on the frontier of colonisation. A report in the Empire magazine in 1872 from Cardwell about the death of 2 fishermen on the 25th of January gives an insight into how the press reported stories and how the native police operated.
A horrible murder has just been committed by the blacks of Gould Island, opposite 2 and 7 miles from our township. The victims were 2 residents of Cardwell named Henry Smith and Charles Clements. The natives, after brutally mutilating the bodies, left them on the beach stripped of everything and decamped with the boat and net. An expedition was at once organised and started in pursuit of these inhuman wretches, and today Mr. Edward Whitfield, accompanied by your correspondent and a few others, arrived here from a visit to the islands, having met Acting Sub-Inspector Johnston's party. I always feel a pleasure in giving praise where praise is due. I consider it my duty here to mention the timely aid afforded by Mr. Johnson, more particularly as his station is about 60 miles from town, and notwithstanding the flooded state of all the creeks in the neighbourhood, he and his 2 troopers succeeded in reaching town safely and immediately proceeded to the scene of the murder. Apart from this, it is an established opinion in this quarter that Mr. Johnston's ability as a native police officer cannot be surpassed. After scouring the numerous islands in our bay, as well as sailing around Hinchinbrook, an island 30 miles long and very mountainous, and visiting all likely spots on this last island, Mr. Johnston and his party returned to town, having recovered the fishing net and 2 boxes. Mr. Acting Sub-Inspector Crompton, who had arrived here 2 days before with 7 native troopers, left here after Mr. Johnston returned, intending to make a further search. And Mr. Crompton, who returned today on the 30th of January from his cruise, only had the fortune to pick up the rudder of the missing boat. And 3 young children were captured by Mr. Crompton and brought to town, 2 girls and a boy. As yet, I cannot say what will be done with them, but it is said that our magistrate will keep the boy.
The taking of the children seems to be common practice. It is most likely that they were lone survivors. The keeping of one of the children by the police magistrate seems to be an acceptable practice in Cardwell in 1872. This story coincides with another Djiru story about Hinchinbrook Island. When a certain missionary decided to set up a Christian mission, the local tribespeople chased him from the island. The native police were sent to the island, which was home to a large population of people. When the missionary returned 3 months after his initial reception, he reports there is no one left on the island and the mission attempt was abandoned. What followed on Bramble Reef, about 30 miles east of Cardwell, on February 26, 1972, would change the life of all the Djiru people forever. A group of 72 pioneers aboard the ship Maria was heading to New Guinea on an expedition to find riches. In a storm, the ship was wrecked on Bramble Reef. What would normally happen is the lifeboats would tow rafts made by the survivors. Eyewitness reports say there were 3 lifeboats, 2 smaller ones becoming disconnected with men on board. The captain, a man named Strauss, and 6 men on board the larger boat, which could have held 25 survivors, abandoned the men left to build rafts. Strauss, who was an inept captain, wrongly assumed the position of Cardwell and went ashore on Djiru land. According to a survivor of the captain's boat that made it back to Cardwell, he and his companions were attacked, and the captain was eaten. He said he and another were forced back into the water, where he waited until dark before escaping and raising the alarm about the shipwreck and the attack. It was wrong to assume that any tribe would feel charity toward shipwrecked sailors. It was seen as women's work to care for infants and those unable to forage for themselves. The survivors could not have understood the lack of compassion. It may account for why some survivors, after receiving aid and then refusing to give up their clothes when asked, were attacked, and then after the clothes were forfeited, they were then aided again. Perhaps the trading Djiru saw it as legitimate trade. To the victims of the attack, it was just an outrage performed by savages. A search party was sent to retrieve the captain's body and boat and was allegedly attacked by up to 120 men at Tam O'Shanter Point. A retaliatory force was sent to punish the attackers and to look for more survivors. The punitive party was sent by Captain Moresby of the Basilisk at the request of the police magistrate in Cardwell Brinsley Sheridan. In charge of the party is Lieutenant Hayter, 2 other officers, 15 seamen, and Robert Johnston in charge of a contingent of native police. 8 men from the small raft were aided and fed for 2 weeks by the local inhabitants before being picked up. The ship that picked up the survivors left gifts for the tribe that aided them. There were 12 on that raft when it left the wreck. 4 men drowned and 1 died from something unknown. When the numbers are crunched, there were 51 men that definitely made it to land, 8 were allegedly murdered with no witnesses, and 3 murders were witnessed. The assistance rendered to the survivors by the local tribes records only a small part of the news articles of the day, but it is mentioned at length by the survivors. One article of clothing taken from a survivor was a specific kind of belt, which Sub-Inspector Johnston found on one of the Djiru tribesmen. When Robert Johnston came across the semi-established Djiru camp on his search, he looked inside a basket and declared it contained half-cooked human flesh. He claims to have found the remains of another shipwreck survivor in one of the other baskets. Captain Moresby of the Basilisk described the attack on the camp.
The tribe was surprised before daylight, and several unfortunate blacks were shot down by the native troopers, who showed an unrestrained ferocity that disgusted our officers.
The Djiru people have their own stories passed down from the people that escaped the massacre that ensued. They say that at dawn the camp was surrounded so that the only escape was along the narrow spit of land now called Tam O'Shanter Point. The native police troopers with hatchets corralled the people onto the edge of the large cliff. Men with rifles were picking off the people trying to escape on the flanks. Over 100 men, women and children were driven over the cliff. Those that made it to sea were shot. The camp was what the Djiru called an old people's camp. It was semi-permanent because there was plenty of food nearby. The warriors found later were probably the ones that attacked the captain's party. The evidence was the belt that was around one of the warriors. Although it is possible this was traded or given as a gift, we have only veiled reports about what happened to them or how many there were. But Ingham got his belt back from Johnston, who assured him the brute who stole it got his comeuppance. There are no reports of the massacre in the media of the day, but the headlines in the media announced that cannibals ate the shipwreck survivors. There is evidence of cannibalism in tribes in the area. In Djiru culture, it was ritual and a form of punishment. It has not been documented as something done out of hunger, but we can never know if it happened to Captain Strauss. If Johnston was telling the truth about what he found, there might have been another explanation about what he saw. It was not customary for people to be buried where they died in Djiru culture. Djiru people had burial sites. They had customs and laws that say who could be buried where and at what time. At any point in time, they may be months away from the proper burial site of the deceased. The Djiru devised a way of storing and transporting the dead bodies using the baskets that they weaved out of local plants. They knew of a weed that grew on the foreshore that, when placed in water, sterilized the saltwater lagoon, killing all the things that would feed on the dead body. If a dead body was placed in the lagoon, the salt would cure it. The process also leached the color out of the skin. It could account for why the first people to see white-skinned people assumed them to be ghosts or dead people come back to life. The cured body could then be broken apart and carried without the problem of decay. Another form of curing was smoking. The body of the deceased is placed on a high platform and a fire is placed underneath. Using leaves and constant monitoring, the fires are maintained until the bodies are adequately cured. These methods were used when it was important that a body needed to be identified or when local laws and customs dictated. Was the partially cooked flesh reported by Johnston a smoke-cured relative of the Djiru, or the remains of Captain Strauss and his companions? The attack on the captain and his crew, the death of Kennedy, the reports of other deaths of settlers in the area, all fueled the fear felt by new settlers. The native police exacted terrible revenge on any tribe found in the vicinity of the settler deaths. Robert Johnston and his troopers accompanied Dalrymple as they explored the rivers around and to the north of Djiru country. After this exploration and the discovery of the great river flood plains, the land was opened for selection. Selection is a government lease arrangement. Selectors would select a parcel of land and pay the government an annual fee for its use. When the land was no longer viable, or they could no longer pay, the land reverted back to government land. On heavily wooded land, it led to widespread clearing. The land clearing removed a lot of the Djiru food sources. Most settlers farming livestock would hunt the local animals that competed for the pasture. There was widespread shooting of the Djiru people, who were seen as a threat. The execution of justice was, however, very one-sided. The death of one settler could result in the extinction of whatever tribal group happened to be in the area. The native police would use an occasion as a way of teaching a lesson to everyone, and over time their methods of brute force, retaliation and reprisal had the desired effect. The term used as coded reference to these massacres was to refer to people being killed as people being dispersed. The death of stock would lead to people being dispersed. Trespassing on land held by selectors would lead to people being dispersed. Insurrection, public shows of disrespect, failing to follow orders, all could lead to people being dispersed. It was sanctioned by the Queensland government, endorsed by the legislators, and condoned and practiced by the settlers. The acts of dispersal were committed in their greatest numbers by the native police. In Djiru country, they were carried out to a large degree by Robert Johnston, after whom the Johnston River and the Shire of Johnston and the town of South Johnston are named.